In the early years of the American Civil War, a black woman from Norfolk, Virginia, named Mary Lou Vester, snuck across Union lines and requested to speak with the Secretary of Navy, Gideon Welles. She had in her possession a curious set of documents so interesting that she was immediately granted an audience with Secretary Welles. Mary showed him blueprints and other documents of a Confederate ship, the former USS Merrimac, being rebuilt as an ironclad vessel and renamed the CSS Virginia. The goal of this ship was to break through the Union blockade that was stifling the South's economy. Mary's heroic adventure deserves a moment in history all to herself, but unfortunately, her story is blurred with conflicting accounts. Despite these conflicts, all versions of the story end the same. This important act of heroism helped set the stage for a turning point in naval warfare, a moment in history called the Battle of Hampton Roads, 1862. Shortly after the Civil War began in 1861, President Lincoln ordered a naval blockade on all the rebel ports. This implemented General Winfield Scott's Great Anaconda Plan, designed to choke the economy of the South. The plan was largely successful, as cotton exports were reduced by 95%. The blockade not only wrecked the Confederacy's economy, but it was a factor in keeping Great Britain out of the war. Britain's sympathy leaned towards the South, and they wanted to recognize the Confederate States as a legitimate, independent country, but they dared not cross the blockade, for it would provoke outright war with the North. Although the Confederate Army was stacking up victories on the battlefield, the naval blockade was a major problem for them. Blockade runners were able to smuggle in a smattering of arms and ammunition, but they knew the flow of war material was not enough to sustain their armies, and the disruption of their cotton trade was already crashing their economy. In response, the Confederacy devised a series of naval guerrilla tactics to try to poke holes in the Union's tight grip. They experimented with torpedo boats, sea mines, and even a revolutionary submarine. But early in the war, their attention was focused on armored ramming ships. When the South declared war on the North, the Gosport shipyard in Norfolk, Virginia, tried to evacuate their ships to the north. However, some ships were unable to get out after the rebels sunk boats to block the channel. To keep the ships out of the rebels' hands, the commander set fire to them. One such ship was the USS Merrimac, a steam screw frigate that had been built 7 years earlier and was sitting in Gosport for repairs. This and other ships were burned to the waterline and then sunk. This ship provided an opportunity for the South, for their industry was incapable of building a steam engine powerful enough to drive an armoured ship. They raised the Merrimac and began work to rebuild her as an ironclad ramming ship. They renamed her the CSS Virginia, although many historical accounts will still call her the Merrimac. The lower hull of the Merrimac and all its machinery was intact. An armoured casemate was built atop a new main deck. The fore and aft decks were redesigned so that all exposed components of the vessel were covered with iron plate and the rest submerged underwater. They decided to also add a ram, something not seen on a ship since the days of the Roman galleys. It is during this reconstruction phase that we return to the espionage work of Mary Lou Vester. Despite the many versions of this story, here is the version as documented by Secretary Welles himself. Working as a steam engineer on the Virginia was a Union sympathizer named William Lyons. Lyons stole the plans of the Virginia and gave them to co-worker Michael Lou Vester, a free black working as a toolkeeper. He in turn gave the plans to his wife Mary. She utilized the Underground Railroad to smuggle herself and the plans north to give to Secretary Welles. The US Navy had known about ironclad ships for years, for they were not new. Experimental ironclads were used with encouraging results by the French in the Crimean War. However, the US didn't show much enthusiasm for the unconventional vessels. The Union Navy even knew of the Virginia being built down in Norfolk. However, they did not know that it was nearly completed until Mary Lou Vester showed them the Confederates' plans. Union officials now began to panic about the realities of a Confederate ironclad. One fear was that the ship could steam up the Potomac River, destroying any wooden warships standing in its way, and arrive in Washington, D.C. to wreak havoc on the nation's capital. Unconventional or not, the Union had to counter the threat of the Virginia with their own ironclad, so Wells organized a commission to vet submitted designs. Several proposals were submitted, but one man stood out because he said he could build an ironclad in 100 days. This man was a Swedish-American engineer named John Ericsson. Despite the Union's reluctance towards unconventionality, Ericsson's design was extreme, and many described it as a cheese box on a raft. The craft floated very low in the water, but the most interesting aspect of the vessel was the pivoting central turret. It housed 2 large-caliber guns. The Navy named this vessel the USS Monitor, and the best description of her was given by author Nathaniel Hawthorne.
It was a platform of iron, so nearly on a level with the water that the swash of the waves broke over it under the impulse of a very moderate breeze. And on this platform was raised a circular structure, likewise of iron, and rather broad and capacious, but of no great height. It could not be called a vessel at all. It was a machine. It looked like a gigantic rat trap. It was ugly, questionable, suspicious, devilish.
The USS Monitor was completed in 101 days. A few trials were conducted, and they found numerous faults that needed fixing. However, the ship was needed to counter the blockade-busting threat of the Virginia. So with very little training nor further trials, the Monitor and her crew of 49 set out from New York towards Hampton Roads. The voyage south was 3 days of disastrous incidents that nearly sunk the ship twice. Issues continued to plague the vessel, and the crew's inexperience added to the challenges, so much so that the ship had to be towed most of the way. The Virginia steamed out into Hampton Roads on the morning of March 8, 1862. She was accompanied by several support ships, but they would play little part in the ensuing battle. The Union Navy had 5 warships in the roadstead, one of them being the steam frigate USS Minnesota. As soon as the Virginia approached, the Minnesota and 2 other ships immediately ran aground while trying to maneuver into better positions. The Virginia headed straight for the remaining 2 warships, Cumberland and Congress. Shots from the Union ships bounced harmlessly off the Virginia's iron plates. Virginia then rammed into the Cumberland, striking her below the waterline. The Cumberland began to sink immediately, and the Virginia's ram was stuck. The ironclad almost went down with the Cumberland had she not managed to back away, breaking off the ram. Even without the ram, the Virginia was still a force to be reckoned with. She had 14 guns, and she now headed for Congress. Seeing how Cumberland fared against the ironclad, the captain of the Congress ran the ship aground, trying to evade Virginia. The ships exchanged shots for over an hour before Congress caught fire and exploded. Despite her armor plating, the Virginia suffered damage. Her smokestack was riddled with holes, 2 of her guns disabled, and several iron plates had come loose. As darkness arrived, she retreated to Sewell's Point for repairs. While the South only lost 2 men in the battle, the Union lost 250 men, 2 ships, and 3 ships run aground. It was the worst U.S. Navy disaster up until that time, only to be superseded by Pearl Harbor. Later that night, the USS Monitor finally arrived at Hampton Roads. She took a position next to the Minnesota, who was still grounded, to protect her. At dawn, the Virginia returned to finish off the Minnesota, but the Monitor stood in her way. The Virginia took the first shot between the first duel of ironclads, but it sailed high and struck Minnesota. Virginia and Monitor exchanged cannon shots for several hours, circling each other at close range, yet neither could adequately penetrate the armor of the other. During the battle, the Virginia proved to be slow and unwieldy. She had a turning radius of about 1 mile, and to make a full circle took 45 minutes. This was a severe disadvantage to the more nimble Monitor. A shell from the Virginia struck the pilot house of the Monitor and temporarily blinded the captain. In the resulting confusion of who had command of the ship, Monitor drew away from the action. Virginia misinterpreted that Monitor had withdrawn from the fight and began to focus on Minnesota again. But the tide was receding, and Virginia had suffered extensive damage from Monitor, so she decided to retire back to Norfolk. Once the Monitor command situation was resolved, she returned to the fight. Only now she saw that Virginia was retreating. Thus both sides declared victory, when in fact the duel was a draw. Historians have argued extensively as to who really won the duel, but ultimately it was a Union victory because Virginia had failed its goal. The Union blockade remained intact. Virginia and Monitor would not fight one another again. After several months, the Confederates decided to abandon Norfolk, since it had little strategic use. Because of a miscommunication with the abrupt withdrawal of the rebel army, the Navy was left with the Virginia in a vulnerable position. Rather than let the ship fall into enemy hands, they decided to blow it up. The Monitor fared little better. She was called up to Beaufort, North Carolina, to assist in the blockade there. A storm caused the ship to take on water faster than they could pump it out. The rising water inside extinguished the boilers, and the crew had to abandon ship. Monitor sunk on December 31st, 1862. Despite all her flaws, the Monitor design showed promise. 20 more Monitor-class ships were built by the end of the war. They proved useful in river campaigns, but the low profile continued to plague the ship's seaworthiness in the rough waters of the open sea. The revolving turret design would live on and form the basis of the modern-day battleship. British, Russian and French naval authorities paid careful attention to the Ironclad duel. While they already were experimenting with armoured ships, the battle proved that the day of wooden warships were all but over. The French even began outfitting their ships with rams, a design that persisted up to World War I. More than a specific battle result, Monitor versus Virginia demonstrated the revolutionary changes underway in naval technology and tactics, with impacts felt globally. It remains one of the most famous and historically important clashes between ships in modern military history. Thank you for watching this moment in history. If you liked this episode, please like and subscribe.